I'm Nabil. I'll be your host for the evening. Welcome to an Essence for Agility event. I'll just quickly give a couple lines about what Essence for Agility is for the newcomers. So Essence for Agility is a community aimed to explore, you guessed it, Essence, which is a standard that describes all the practices and methods that enables us to better pick the right set of practices that suit our context, regardless of which method they belong to, which can also improve our application of said agile methods. The tagline we have for it is Essence frees practices from the method prisons, which is a line that I definitely love. So that's a quick couple lines about the Meetup group for the first timers. The event we have for you today is a really interesting one because it's a follow-up to one we did at the start of the month. We had some lovely guests with us where we explored the different agile practices that teams can use and how they work together, how we go about selecting them. We had a lovely, lively, robust discussion with several great panelists. And today's event is a follow-up from that, where we're going to explore Essence a bit more specifically to see how it can address these problems or help in this area. And the good news I have for you today is that I won't be doing a lot of talking or asking a lot of questions like I normally do on these events. Instead, I'll just be handing over to our lovely speakers. I'll be enjoying the margarita that my wife kindly made for me, and I'll just be enjoying the show like a participant for a change, which I'm personally looking forward to. So I'll just give a quick one-liner on our speakers though before I hand over. So in no particular order, we have Simon Girvan, who has been with us before as a speaker, and I've been on one of his courses before as well, which I really loved. He's an experienced Agile coach and co-author of a recent book called Agile from First Principles. So if you haven't heard of that before, give it a whirl. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but I'm looking forward to. The next speaker we have is Bernie Clark. He's an experienced software and systems developer, a methodologist, and a coach that loves fantastic ideas. He's also been with us before, and very happy to welcome him back. And last but not least, we have Michael Flynn. I had the pleasure of working with him recently on a client for a short period of time. So I'm very glad that I can host him here at our Meetup event. He's ranges from an ex-developer, release manager, come agile coach who has recently started working with the Essence Toolkit to help organizations evolve their practice libraries. And of course, we have Ivar present as well, who needs no introduction, so he may chip in and contribute throughout the evening. So those are the lovely speakers we have with us today. I'm going to hand over to Ivar now for a quick introduction from him.
Host has disabled screen sharing.
Well, let me fix that right now.
Okay.
And there you go. Now you should be able to screen share.
Okay, so. All right, so thank you very much for joining us today. I have a few slides just to set the scene for this meeting. Last meetup, we invited 3 people who have really contributed to the software engineering, and in particular to Agile. We had Dave Farley and Jeff Patton and Gabriella Benedin. Sorry, I don't remember her last name. She couldn't show up, but she was invited. She was stuck in some Greek island with no internet. So we started up that meeting by saying we have a landscape of software development techniques and practices. We just drew this picture that give a feeling of a landscape. And we mentioned a number of provinces here, areas, and they are no way complete. They are maybe not even the right ones even, probably not, but they represent landscapes. And in this landscape, we want to move and deliver value. And that value is delivered through journey.
Eva, sorry to interrupt. Just checking if you're sharing your screen or...
Yes, I am.
I don't think we can see it, so maybe you can try again.
Okay, then I have to go back. Yeah, sorry for that. So now I try again. Share screen.
Yep. Now we can see it. Perfect.
Okay, good. I go back to the beginning. This is the landscape. And as I said, the different provinces or areas have no particular meaning. It just indicates there are areas in our world. And then we want to take a journey in this landscape from one point to another. And unfortunately, I'm not good at showing how you work iteratively in this landscape. But you can imagine we go through these provinces many times. And here are some techniques. There are probably hundreds of different practices, techniques, or methods, whatever we call it, frameworks. And you may, on your journey, select one or many of these. But the problem is, how do you choose these techniques? They are all designed by someone, an expert or a guru, and each one of them have their own way of describing their technique, their practice, whatever. And they are not following any particular standard in general. So how do you select? How do you know you don't have conflicts? How do you know they don't overlap? I think this is one of the big, really serious problems we have in our world. People get stuck in one of them and maybe never see the others. This is what we want to discuss. We discussed it last time. And I think we discovered that the speakers had not really thought much about this problem. There were no real solutions suggested. At the end, I said that this is one of the problems. I said one of the problems that Essence are trying to address. And today we are going to discuss it and see how would Essence address this problem. So let's move to Bernie. Maybe you can take over here.
Sure, thank you, Eva. So I'm coming at this from a practitioner's point of view as a coach, working in organizations that are trying to do transformations. And the challenge that I've had is that whenever we attempt to do a transformation, I like to put together a transformation backlog. And whether we're doing SAFe or anything else, we need to work out how is this organization going to have the right capabilities to develop software. And in doing that, I've come up with a proprietary backlog of things that I think are important areas of concern. I've worked with computer associates in the past who had a card deck of different areas of concerns. And when I came across Essence through Eva, that struck me as being a way to solve that problem about having all these different proprietary areas of concern and actually having some common language around that and helping us decide what should we focus on as an organization in our transformations. So to that end, I would like to turn to Simon and say, how's Essence going to help in real life an organization make decisions around their software development lifecycle and capabilities?
Great question, Bernie. Thank you. I'll share my screen a little bit as well in a second, but I think before we talk about real organizations, it's worth just stepping back a bit and just reminding ourselves what Essence is, because the more I work with Essence, the more dimensions to it I see and the more uses of it I see. And there's bits of Essence that are kind of hidden away a little bit that people sometimes forget about that actually can be really, really powerful. And one of them I want to talk about in particular is activity spaces. But first, if we just remind ourselves what Essence is, I know this is an Essence group, so we probably assume many of us understand Essence, but equally it might be a while since we've come across it, and it's worth just reminding ourselves. So there's kind of three bits of Essence that I wanted just to talk about. There's three different ways really of looking at the common ground. So a lot of what Essence brings is this notion that you can define a common ground. And I want to talk about, I think, the three ways it does so. One is through this idea of alphas, and Bernie even talked about areas of concern, but we've got these things that always happen. There's customer needs to be met, there's a solution that gets delivered, and there's an endeavor that a team undertakes to do that. And then that breaks down into those 7 things. And those are a really good set of common grounds. So we know that there's work to be done with stakeholders. We know we need to understand our opportunity, and all those things on the right are important things for us to understand. And you can relate practices down into those as to what do they do. So for example, that set of things that Eva was showing on the landscape, well, things like, story mapping is going to help us understand how our opportunity relates to our requirements, and it's going to help us understand our stakeholders a bit better. Something like behavior-driven development is going to help us in sort of similar way, but in slightly differently. And then you've got things like Scrum or Kanban, which really helps us down in the blue section. The second bit, though, is activity spaces, and I think these get forgotten about quite a lot. And this is a different set of things that always happen in teams. Teams always do these things. They explore possibilities. They understand stakeholder needs, they test the system. They might not have a defined practice to help them do it, but they do it anyway. And in a team, they might not need much more guidance than just knowing that these things are happening, but also there are activities that practices put into that sort of space. And across different ways of working, they're all going to call these things different names, but they're doing the same thing. We might call something a feature, or we call it an epic, or we call it a story, or we call it a requirement, and even different organizations might have a different meaning of what a word feature is, but ultimately they're all about understanding the requirements on this set of activity spaces. And then the final thing Essence does is it gives us an actual language, so we can describe any practice using a set of common language. And that means that we can then start to compare things a lot more easily. So we've got this, not just a language and a syntax, but also the meaning underneath it, the semantics. So how do things connect? So we can see that, an activity has an activity space that it's in, and it affects a state of an alpha. And then you've got that kind of purpose of activities as well. So that's one thing that I think is worth coming back to. And I want to focus a little bit on the activity spaces later. I'll just stop sharing just now. But one thing I wanted just to make clear, and this something people often forget as well, is Essence itself isn't a framework. It doesn't tell you how to do all those things. It tells you you've got to be doing something to progress the states of your stakeholders, understanding and things like that. It tells you about these activity spaces, you should be doing stuff inside, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. That's the job of the practices. And that's why, Essence isn't about replacing an existing framework. It's about helping you understand it better and potentially opening up other things that you can bring in from other frameworks that you can't otherwise do because it's not easy to access. And it's like Nabil says, that the freeing practices from method prisons. So I think that thinking about Essence in terms of a language to describe how practices operate, activity spaces as a common ground what all teams need to do. And then those alphas as common things you need to care about allows you to kind of understand how lots of different practices can work together.
Well, I think that's really helpful. So that if I'd had this when I was doing my work, it would have helped me focus on specific things. But then what if I just buy a framework? You know, I know you said, I mean, I could just say, well, why do I have to learn all of this stuff? But I'll go buy SAFe, or I'll go, you know, train everybody in this. Do either of you, Mike or Simon, have some thoughts about why I shouldn't just do that and be done with it?
Well, plenty of people do. And plenty of people will sell you a framework, and they'll promise you, Bernie, that it'll do everything you want to do. And I think there's kind of two things that I want to draw out here. One is that kind of old adage that one size doesn't fit all. Even however much you want it to, it's really hard to find one size that fits all. And the second is that when you've got a big thing that tries to cover lots of different scenarios, inevitably you've got a lot of stuff going on, and the guidance is often to tailor that down, remove the things you don't need. In practice, that doesn't really happen. But first, I think it probably is worth mentioning that those big frameworks, they will work in certain circumstances, and they work for quite a lot of teams. And there's lots of good examples of people that have applied things like LESS or SAFe or disciplined Agile and had great success. However, it's also the case there's teams that have tried those things and they haven't had great success. Sometimes it's the same organizations in a different part are having not such great success compared to their colleagues, and even the same team on a different project can sometimes find it doesn't work as well as it did the first time. And I think that's because typically we're working in this complex space of knowledge work where things aren't easy to predict, and what worked well in the past doesn't work well necessarily in the future. And all these big frameworks are built on lots of experience of how things were working in the past, and they're asserting that these things will all work well in the future, and they might, but also they might not. So they've integrated all these things together and done a nice job of it, right? They're nice, big, impressive frameworks. And one of the things that makes them impressive is that they're coherent. They've got consistent language. They've got lots of references to other parts of it. And what that means is they end up overloading some of the language. So we've got lots of unique language, and it makes it quite hard to step outside the framework. So like I said a second ago, you've got a feature over here and a feature over there. Well, are they the same thing? They might be, but they might not. And I've got to learn extra language, like, and not just things like release trains or area product managers, but even within in-house, we see a lot of custom language. People give names to groupings of work that are unique to that organization. And it makes it quite hard to kind of step outside that. So you're kind of forced into this one size fits all. And what Essence lets you do is normalize all that language. So you can understand how things connect. You've got the semantics underneath it, and you can start to see that this set of things over here that was helping with my requirements is very similar to that set of things over there in a different method that was helping with my requirements. Well, which one's better for this situation? It might be one or it might be the other, but I want to be able to choose. I want to be able to compare different approaches, because I've got a unique problem to solve each time. Well, I probably need a unique solution as well. So there's definitely that kind of part of it. And then the other part is that tailoring down. So Ivar knows this from the RUP days. First rule of RUP was there's only one essential artifact. Everything else is optional. What did people do? They bundled everything into their projects and they did them all, because it was easier to do that than not to. It requires a lot of skill and judgment to tailor down properly. It's a lower risk just to do it all. And something Jeff was saying actually, that writing down something adds weight and heaviness to it, or at least you perceive it has. But also when you write something down, you're probably going to add extra stuff. And then what happens is, you end up with something that was maybe a recommendation, now it becomes a strong recommendation, and it gets perceived as an instruction. And before you know it, you've bundled.
In summary, scaling down really doesn't work. It requires too much competence to do it. And that I learned a bit away in RUP.
Yes.
And what Essence does, the opposite. It starts with nothing. It starts with those kernel things I showed you, and none of them tell you what to do. They just say these things should happen. And you might find that actually my team's pretty experienced. They're quite small. They understand the problem space. They can just crack on and do it without needing any help. Another team next door might be more junior or with a more complicated product, or in a scenario where they've got regulatory requirements to worry about, and they need to bring in more rigor and more structure.
Okay.
But Essence, it makes it easy to build up because you haven't got this big world of things presented to you. You start with nothing and you add on top.
Right. So my spies out there tell me that Mike Flynn might have experience in these matters. And Mike, could you talk to your experience of working with teams getting this done?
Yeah, I mean, mainly I'm covering when we're using Essence with multiple organizations, we're seeing this idea of improving existing methods. So, you know, somebody's adopting Scrum, somebody's adopting, you know, user stories, whatever practice they're adopting. Actually, by looking at it through this Essence lens, we can get a much better understanding of it, or understand which parts of it we need to improve. Yeah, and that's one thing that Essence brings to it. There's a set of games that we have that, you know, you can spotlight your sprint reviews. Yeah, look at what that means when we put the you know, like Scrum into, or user stories into Essence. We condense it down to its really important parts. So that allows you to inspect each part of those and then improve. You know, this idea of iterating through improvements of not just what we're working on, but the way we're working as well. And that's one of the key things. I was chatting to someone in one of our organizations the other day we work with, and they were, I don't get it. What is it? And when me and Simon started chatting to them about it, they went, oh, so it's a growth tool. And that is quite a nice, neat way. I've never heard someone call it that before, but actually it ties into that affinity loop that, you know, between doing and learning that Eva talks about. And it definitely does that. So we work with organizations. We encourage them to that. Look at your existing practices through Essence. We don't want you to replace. This isn't something that's replacing anything existing. It's complementary to a lot of things that we're doing. Once we find the organization do that, they can see actually, okay, so this is our practices built. Maybe we need to start thinking about the things that we do, which isn't covered within these you know, within these methodologies frameworks, because a lot of companies do very bespoke things, yeah, that you can't possibly get covered within a framework. They have distinct technical practices, they've got distinct compliance rules, yeah, which they need to understand, and they and it's important for their teams to understand who's got you know, whose head's on the line for those things, or at least I know that you know, I'm responsible for doing certain tasks or for certain parts of practices, and that's really helpful to people working in organizations, but to organizations themselves. So
yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
because what you're doing is telling people that this is what you're responsible for. Go, you know, work out how you're going to do it. And when you've worked it out, encapsulate that knowledge so that if you're blazing a trail, other people can follow what you're doing.
And they're defining that, the people doing the work are defining those practices as well. So it's not a mandated thing from governance, but we see how other practices are created. You know, our team inspects the way that we're working as a team, whatever level within the organization that team's on, and then we can start creating these practices and saying, actually, this is the way we work. The advantages of doing that is you don't have to keep repeating to everybody in your organization what it is you're doing. Yeah, you've actually got it in a central place. We're using something called TeamSpace now, where we can store all our practices in. So we can have a look at our practices in there. People can go into that, look up what practices are, look up what people do. So it's a really useful tool for that type of thing. What we do find is teams don't use Essence every day, but when they do use it, it's very powerful for them. And that's a key thing. Do you know what I mean? That yeah, we're not going to be using it like Jira every day, but actually when we do use it, it's going to really help us you know, improve, iterate around our improvements, figure out what we're supposed to be doing, is that the right thing to do, and then improve it. And the next thing I probably want to mention is this this idea around I think Ian mentioned it in the last call, a common operating model, or sometimes we like to refer to as minimal viable governance. Yeah, so whereas as an organization, we can really start to think about, you know, what practices do we have to do as a group? Yeah, what practices should we do? What technical things, what architectural procedures, all those things can we put in there? Can we define what accountabilities are within an organization? Because I know a lot of people like to be free and easy, but equally, a lot of people like to have defined what they're accountable for and understand that. Software being so complex, we can do it bespoke to the organization that you're working in. So that's what we're finding when we're using Essence. I will say there's a twist on it. We do find organizations who go off-piste, they also don't want to document. So it's trying to find that balance. Do you know what I mean? Just about making sure that you understand the value of Essence and creating practices rather than just going out into the wild and trying random
every time.
Yeah.
So it sounds what I'm hearing. I think I'm hearing empowerment, which I really like. I like teams getting involved and using their experience rather than just being told what to do. I'm hearing minimal governance. Measure what matters, basically, which is a nice thing to have. This all sounds.
The other thing I maybe I came across there was the fact that when you adopt a framework, it iterates through different versions of its framework very slowly. But actually, within an organization, we learn much faster. So we'll try a practice out. We'll say, hey, we need to tweak it, and then evolve it. Whereas the framework won't be keeping up to that same speed as your organization. You might want to be swapping things in and out because you've learned things. So that's the other advantage of using Essence, actually. It gives us this, when Simon was talking about activity spaces, that allows you to say, actually, these are things that we need to do. Whatever practices and methods we plug into this, are we actually doing what we need to do, or are we living in a land of make-believe?
Right. So you not only end up then, I'm kind of leading the witness, but it seems to me you end up with people engaged in what they're doing and why they're doing it. But also, you did mention there that you really are accumulating a corporate asset, really, of knowledge. So the organization is growing in its capabilities to do these things, which I used to think was a selling point, for organizations. Knowledge is an asset. We used to think it cost $500,000 if you lost a person, because you'd lose their knowledge, and then you've got to retrain somebody else when they come in. So we were,
interestingly,
very expensive.
One of the organizations we've been chatting to was saying, so we've got this tool called TeamSpace now, which we're looking at, and they said to us, 95% of the people going to be using TeamSpace will not care about Essence. They'll want to know what they need to do to get their job done. What they're accountable for. What practices they do. Maybe they want to learn something about what not. That's really what we're trying to cater for. So. But Essence gives you that power. It helps you explain something in common terminology, and then people then can use that for lookup. Michelle's asked the question, actually. She said, are you recommending this is applied team-specific level and not at a higher level? No, I'm not. We see it being applied at team level and at other levels as well. So we're looking at the whole organization sometimes, and then other times we're working with teams. So,
the nice thing, Michelle, about what Mike was explaining earlier, where you've got this common operating model, this sets out a handful of really, important mandatory practices, and then a wider range of optional practices, is you can actually have both. You can have several teams all working in slightly different ways, adapted to what their unique situation is, but they might all be applying the same, for example, security practice or compliance practice. So it allows you to actually have quite a lot of variance, but within an overall, risk model.
So referring back to Ivar's diagram at the beginning there, it strikes me that all journeys aren't the same. I think he said that different endeavors are different. I might just send out a little scouting party on a journey, and they might play the games, Mike, that you were talking about. Presumably I can learn how to play those games and come up with some exploratory practices as they go on their way that may or may not be used. They might try one or two different things, and it's thereby learning as you go, and then over time that can be accumulated to the organizational level. Is that what you guys are saying?
Yeah, actually, that's exactly what we do. So, a team will try out a method. If it's successful, they can then share it with other teams, or a practice. They can then share it with other teams. If it's something that would stick in your organization, then you can share it with everyone. If so needed, you could bring it up into the common operating model there. Say, actually, now we're gonna mandate this as a practice because it's helping our team so much. So, yeah, we definitely encourage that type of thing.
It lets people document that quite easily as well. So it's easy for teams to end up with a lot of what I call sort of tacit practices, stuff that they do, but they just do it without really thinking about it. They might not even know they're doing it. They might not be explaining it to people. Whereas if you can start thinking about what you're doing in terms of those, and there's only 4 language elements, is this an activity? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What work products does it create? And you can capture that really quite simply and easily. And then if you are going to be running an experiment, you can say, well, did this work? And is it making the impact on, say, for example, our stakeholder relationships that we thought it would? Or is it having the impact on the quality of our product that we thought it would? And if it does, then maybe you share that with your colleagues. And if it doesn't, maybe you look at, is there a way to evolve that practice or pick up a different practice that can help? But finding ways to easily document stuff without it being a burden. And then if you want to put more depth of rigor into your documentation, you can, but you could get by with just naming your, say, for example, it's an activity, just naming it and then saying, well, why am I doing it? What state is it going to help me achieve? What documents or work products is it going to help me create? And, what's a brief description of that? Could be a sentence. You could create that in, 2.5 minutes. Whereas we're very often scared of documentation, thinking it's a very arduous, long, drawn-out process, as sometimes it is, but it doesn't have to be.
So again, I really like Ivar's picture at the beginning, because when I go on this journey, like I said, I could go on a scouting mission or something, but I could also want to put some things in my wagon, if you like, that are already available to me. Like, I understand that Scrum has been essentialized. It's not like, oh, you can't use things that are there already. There are some amazing methods and things that have been essentialized already that I could say, oh, I'll take that one with me. And this other area, maybe we'll invent something new and try something new on the way. But because the Scrum's been essentialized and it's set out in the same structural framework, I can plug in my new one and it will play well, with those essentialized practices. Is that something that you guys see happening?
Yeah, we do that. Scrum, Kanban, Spotify. There's loads we've done. The list of user stories, use cases. There's and all of those are in our practice library. So
you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You can pick and choose.
No, most people don't actually, Bernie. They don't. They'll be using something pretty similar to Scrum or doing Scrum, but they do some extra stuff on top. Or they'll be doing Safe, but they'll actually have some other roles that they have to have within their organization, which they want to define. I worked in medical software previously, and we had clinical safety specialists. A critically important role within what we did, but wasn't mentioned within Safe, wasn't mentioned within Scrum. But actually, it was really important for us to define their role, their accountabilities, how they intermingled with the software, with our software teams. And that's really important stuff for our organization, because a clinical risk issue is somebody's safety at the end of the day. You don't want something bad to happen to people. You have to build things like that into your process. It isn't overly complex, but like Simon said, we're not saying go overboard on documentation, but just capture those key things and those key moments where they need to happen.
It's quite interesting with looking at other people's practices as well, where Ian Spencer was here last time, worked with Jeff Sutherland on essentializing that Scrum practice. And just the very act of trying to break Scrum down into those different bits, which is in essence, in reality, quite simple, it raised quite a lot of questions. And Jeff was really thinking, well, what does this bit of Scrum mean? Is this, how does it relate to other things? And he found that actually the act of writing his practice in Essence language made it better, and it helped him understand it differently. And that's why he finds that using the essentialized version of Scrum in his teaching is more effective with his students, because the act of essentializing has made it easier to understand. And we see that with client practices too, where there's sometimes inconsistencies and sometimes even mistakes in their practice that get exposed when you try to write them in essence.
So I see Ivar had a thought.
Yeah, say something. Yeah, thank you. We, as a company, we don't really promote any particular practices. We have, of course, as everyone else, preferred practices that we like to work with. But we think it's very important that if we work with someone and essentialize someone else's work, we want that person or that group to be responsible for the result. So we don't essentialize just because we feel we can do it. We are quiet. We try to convince others to essentialize their work. So today we have, we had never been like today. A year ago, we had probably 2 or 3 work on essentialization. Today we have about 12, 13 people who want to work with us on essentializing their work. And the reason is it becomes simpler to teach, simpler to use and apply. And there are so many values that methodologists generally don't think about. Methodologists have a head full of trying to make good practices, great ideas. And that's really important that they do that. But their focus is not to make it easy to adopt, make it really enjoyable and playful. And today, most methods are described in a passive way. You read it, you can look at websites, you can look at videos and books and everything, but it's passive. A modern way of working, which is what Essence provides, is an active way of learning. So people work interactively with the method instead of just reading and learning.
Right. So I don't just play the games to build the methods. I actually use the method in my decision making as a team. You know, the team will get around the table and use and say, well, what state are we taking this artifact to next? Or what are we going to do next? So they're actually playing the method or playing the practice.
Normally, most games, we have used games for 30 years in software engineering. And the reason they are popular is because people become engaged and motivated, and people start to talk to one another. It's not one person that dominates, it's usually the team. That is the thing that is new now, is that the team is very active in working and learns through gaming.
And through doing,
The thing, what I wanted to say actually is that traditional games are just based on syntax, intuitive syntax. There is basically no semantics. The semantics comes through the wording, and people can intuitively understand it. So the problem is you cannot create many games, and maybe there is 10 games that people understand intuitively. With Essence, since it has a formal language with a deep semantics, which no user really need to understand, but it makes it possible to play hundreds of games. So for instance, just playing games with a kernel, Essence, you may have 10 different, just the kernel, Essence, you can have easily 10, 20 games. And I don't know exactly how many we have, but I think it's something between 10 and 20. But then every practice of any significant size brings another 10 or 20 games. And these games are not just for fun. They are to progress the work. So they are serious games.
That sounds interesting. So Nabil, before we get over to audience questions, I just had a couple more thoughts. It strikes me the old days of COTS, components off the shelf. You guys remember that? Mixing and matching components. It sounds there's a bit of that going on. And so it drew me to thinking about vendors. Have either of you, Simon or Mike or Eva, thought about or use Essence in integrating with vendors in an endeavor?
There's definitely, it's one of the games that Eva talked about. There's some interesting games around practices where you've got suppliers, from other companies in your supply chain. So you've hired some other organizations to help you with your delivery, where you need to get some alignment or some agreement on who's responsible for what. And you can play some games around the game. It's called Contract Bridge, but you take each activity or each artifact and say, well, are we jointly responsible, or is it the supplier, or is it the customer? So there's certainly some things around looking at the practices you'll be working with suppliers together on and agreeing where people stand in terms of responsibility. So there's definitely that angle of it. Is that the sort of thing you had in mind?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's so everybody, it sounds to me like you can talk the common language and come to an agreement. So, and they can participate as you go. Sorry?
I was going to say, it also allows you to have suppliers that talk a different language or use different practices, but you've got that commonality. So you can say, well, it doesn't matter that you're using, user stories and we're using use cases, because we can see what they're both doing in terms of the Essence language, and we can see how they can interact with one another and where you've got the connection between things. And it gives you something as an international standard that allows you to say, here's what we expect in terms of our interface with you.
I think you guys have answered pretty much most of the questions I had at the in the forefront of my mind. Eva, thoughts?
Yeah, I think so too. I think your questions were good, and I think you got some answers. But what I really would like to emphasize: have we answered the original question loud and clearly? Namely, you have all these hundreds of techniques and practices. In what way does Essence solve the problem of being able to select and find the practice that work the best for you? Have you answered that question loud and clearly?
Well, for me, I'm biased here because I think I've heard you guys talk about things before. But for me, it sounds like yes, in that it gives me a way to standardize the team, everybody's thinking. We could get together and discuss choices, but we know what things we need to have, because Essence is telling you should address these concerns, these areas, whether it be the activity spaces or capabilities or the alphas. It's giving me some guidelines to think about these things and say to the group, if I'm trying to coach them, okay, let's all get around and think about these things. And then also to talk about choices. Right? We could possibly do this using use cases. We could use it using user stories. We could use it, how do we go? What's our best approach? Should we try both? So is it loud and clear? I don't know. It is for me, in that it's not telling me exactly what I have to do, but it's giving me a way to help teams make the decisions about what they feel it is best for them to do, and that will work, that will be true software engineering, really. Not just have a go and let's see what happens. It's have a go, but yeah, let's think about these principles as we go. So that's it for me. I think I'll hand it over to getting whatever you guys want to do next.
Simon, what do you think?
I think Bernie described it nicely there at the end, actually, where it's easy to say, I'll tell you what to do. You tell me your problem and I'll sell you a solution that dictates the set of things you need to do to get there. And yet, certainly in a complex world, that's a big ask. You're asking me to predict all the things that will happen in the future. Whereas if you say, like Bernie was saying, teams can just crack on and see how they get on, but at least you've given them a framework that says when you are doing those things, you can test, have I satisfied what this activity space talks about? Have I moved this alpha towards the value on my landscape? Am I making steps in the right direction on that map? And if I am, that's great. And if I need some help, I can go and find a practice, but I'm not being told what to do. And certainly a lot of modern teams don't want to be told what to do, but they often need a bit of structure and a bit of guidance. And they need different levels of leadership and different levels of support, depending on all kinds of things, partly their culture, but also their experience, their skill, their environment. In essence, it allows you to kind of ground all those things in a set of common ground, common language, that still maintains the ability for teams to have flexibility, which is generally what you want, because you are going to be crossing that map in different ways. And like you said at the beginning, Ivar, you go through that cycle iteratively, maybe every sprint.
Yeah, I think the general answer to the original question is that assuming we have an ecosystem with all practices described, then you can, of course, compare, because we are using similar language. And there are some things that really are similar, and you can you can understand it easily because you know the language, you know the jargon. So the dream is, of course, that we get more and more practices described and techniques described using Essence. And for good, since Essence is not a homegrown language, a homegrown technique, it's developed by hundreds of people in standardization forum. It has gone through a process that you'd never find in one single company or in one domain. All right, so I give up now. I think
I have one thing I just quickly want to add is that Simon mentioned complexity, and it did occur to me that the start of every one of those journeys could be different, and I think it's something that Ivar might talk about in the future, about how we can, when we start our journey, is it, we think about Kinefin maybe or something like that, is like, where are we when we start? That's going to affect what our endeavor is going to be. Is it complex? Is it easy, etc.? So I think that's an exciting area too. Now I'll shut up.
I just raised my hand. No one saw it, but I'll just talk.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the other point I've noticed is that more and more managers are starting to embrace this leadership role. This guiding teams, or making sure, how do we mature our teams rather than tell them what to do. And Essen gives the team a way to document clearly how they're working. And I think that's what a lot of managers want to be assured of these days, is that actually the teams are working in a coherent, disciplined fashion. Yeah, however they're doing it, whether they're using a method off the shelf or wherever they're doing something. I'll go back to the previous the previous talk that we had here, that what are the key things that we deliver? High quality software, we're delivering it more quickly, however we're doing it, meeting those metrics that we've got to meet. As long as we're doing it in a good fashion, that's really what's becoming more and more important, rather than are we having a great stand-up, or do you know what I mean? Was our plan successful? So
Nabil, I see Mike Levingson's got his hand up. Do you want to help him help him ask his question?
Yeah, of course. So now it sounds like we're in the audience Q&A section. So if anyone else has questions, feel free to use the raise hand feature. I can see there's some already in the chat, so you can write it there as well. But Mike, why don't you kick us off with your question?
Thanks, Nabil, and thanks everybody else for contributing. So probably worthwhile starting off by saying I'm totally new to Essence, so this is the first exposure I've had to it. And this is more a comment than a question, maybe. So from my experience, much of the conversation's been quite contextual and abstract. And I wonder whether it would benefit for some having some walkthroughs of how it actually gets used. It seems to me that the walkthroughs might be a little different. So if you're talking at a team level and how they would use it, as opposed to how managers would potentially want to look across different teams and see what possibilities are the organization may have, and what learning opportunities may be given to other teams. But I think an actual walkthrough would answer the sort of the whys, the hows, and what value we're trying to get out of it and how we achieve that value. So comment from me.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, and that's good point. So we have examples we can show you. I'm going to share some links in a bit before we close with some practical things you can do, but they're again a little bit abstract because it's basically around using the activity spaces and working with the team to understand how good you think you are in each of those activity spaces. So like we're great at this to we don't really understand this at all, and then use that as a way to identify actions you can take. So I'm going to share some ways to do that. The best example of how we've done this sort of in practice is probably the stuff that Mike was talking about earlier, where they had this desire to try to cope with almost contradictory situations, where some teams that were really getting on well with SAFe and they really wanted to stay with that and it was working really well for them. Other teams that were really wanting to be completely autonomous, completely agile, and they didn't want to be told anything. They said, leave it to us, we're the experts. And how do you manage both those sorts of teams at once, and how do you build some kind of structure around it? And the way that they did it was by trying to identify some really core things that they wanted, and that was around a lightweight way of planning, which was started off quarterly but became sort of continuous. A set of practices they expected teams to use. They want them to be agile, so have some kind of iteration. Mostly teams are using Scrum or Kanban, so they were supporting both of those with communities of excellence, and they wanted this, agile support for that, but they didn't mind what they used. And then they had particular set of values, and actually values is a really good way to enter this and think about what's important to us as an organization. Then you can make sure those values are reflected in the activities and the way that you work. And then they had a set of other things around leadership, and the leadership was using language that made sense to them. They didn't want to use language that was out of, say, Scrum at Scale or SAFe, but they wanted to make it feel unique and bespoke. And of course, what you can do is if, say, for example, you've got the executive meta Scrum concept in Scrum at Scale, if that was mostly what they wanted, we can just create a practice that is largely the same, with all the same hooks and all the same knowledge that went into building that practice, but call it language that made sense to them. So you're able to build a really customized, tailored set of practices that make sense to that organization. And then from a team's perspective, they know what they must do, and they've got some things to choose from. So when they begin a project, they say, well, here's the practices the Agile community of excellence recommends. But if you want to do something else, that's fine. But you must be doing your planning every quarter, and in this way, you must report up in the right sort of way. Is that helpful, Mike? Is that the kind of thing you meant? We could walk you through some examples and things, but not in 2 minutes.
I think my response to that is that is also definitely coming soon. We've got a tool that we're working on, TeamSpace, and what we hope to do is we'll build some just fake examples in there, and that we make up of actually of things that have happened, but not actually give the client's name away or anything like that. Just examples of actually real world scenarios, real world games we built, or real world minimal viable bureaucracies that we've built with organizations, or examples of them. So my response to that is it'll come soon, actually.
Eva? So maybe we can
I'll jump in anyway.
Follow up with Mike and help him.
So I'll just jump in very quickly. So Mike Flynn, I think, examples are great. Interactive examples where you can actually ask them questions, for me, are even better, because I can go, well, why did you do that? Or what happens if we do this? And so the interactivity of it is really great. And Simon, I think sort of same response to you. Again, you learn in various people learn in various ways. It's just an additional way of trying to unambiguously get across one approach, I guess. Anyway, but thank you for the answers.
Great. Thank you so much, guys, for the question and answers. Maybe it's an idea for a future meetup event to get our hands-on taste of Essence, which we actually did last year. So maybe we could repeat a similar session.
And just quickly to that, Jorgen had a question. Maybe he could attend that because he's wanting to know, as an independent agile coach, how could he leverage Essence? So maybe that's the way to do it, right? Is to have a session and show them how to use it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Do you guys have, I'll just stop, and do you guys have other thoughts on how an independent person can leverage Essence, or is the recommendation mainly to go to the session? Yeah, go for it.
I'm the independent person. So, and although I'm not doing it actively right now, yes. So it is that business of going, when you're looking at an organization and doing gap analysis, working with them to say, what are you missing here? Or what are you doing extra that you actually need to embrace? And so Essence will help have that common conversation with them. You don't have to come in with secret powers. You can just lay it on the table and say, look, a well-organized, a good agile organization does these things. Right? They address these things in different levels. So I think that's where I would use it to start.
Okay, we don't need to answer every question, all of us, but I want just to add that Paul McMahon has for years talked about how he used Essence in stealth mode. No one knows he's talking about Essence, but he uses it as an independent consultant, in particular working with the defense industry in the US. And so Paul McMahon is probably not here today, but he usually attends these meetings.
Interesting.
Absolutely. Al Shalloway, you had a question. Would you like to unmute and ask? Or if not, then I can read it out for you.
No, I can ask. Because I've been following Ivar and Essence for actually quite some time, and I've always loved it, thought it was brilliant. I still think it's brilliant. But I realize I might have misinterpreted something, and I just want to be clear. And I think I like this neutrality, I guess I would say, which is it creating a model that in and of itself doesn't have really any recommendations except these are things you better attend to. And it provides an abstract, I don't know if I want to say cohesive set because I haven't studied it enough, but I suspect it does because Ivar sharp, and I think that'd be necessary. But then what you do is, if you're looking for, as a practitioner, well, I want to use Essence, but how do I start? Where do I go? That you find some practice where they basically Essenized it, or I don't know what the right word is, but that's how you then get a starting point, and now you have freedom to extend it as you want to because they're giving you a starting point. Like I could see Scrum has a lot of starting stuff, but now you can go beyond it. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, that sounds good to me, actually.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I'll be candid. I didn't totally appreciate that. Ivar, sorry, you probably told me that any number of times. But I like that because it creates a totally neutral platform, not just a platform that can be used most anywhere. And so that's all. That was my question. That's great. I'm really happy to hear that.
Yeah,
and even the Scrum games, sorry, Mike.
I was going to say what we're finding is that some people are just looking at the method itself. You mentioned Scrum and learning more about it and applying that. Then some teams are actually adding on bits, to say, actually, we do this other stuff that we need to add on, but we're still going to do Scrum. And then you have another version as well where people are saying, actually, we only want to do these bits of Scrum, rightly or wrongly. I know Jeff would not be too happy about that, but that's actually a pattern that we're seeing out in industry where they're saying, actually, these certain things work for us, but not all of it. But at least we've got the description of those.
Yeah, I could see another use, and this would maybe help answer Jorgen's question. If one of the things I find is most people don't think very abstractly, and Essence is clearly an abstract model, and that can be confusing, but it's actually very powerful because it provides you a way to go in and talk to people who are looking for specifics. And you could say, well, this is an implementation of this concept, and then here are other implementations. And I think as a teaching, not of what to do, but a teaching guide of how to think and how to navigate the real world, I think that's brilliant. That's one of the things I've always liked about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Tom, you had a question a short while ago in the chat. Would you like to ask it? I can see you talking, but I can't hear anything. So something may be up with your microphone. Still can't hear you. I can see some animated hand gestures. Maybe you could mime it to us.
Hello, can you hear me now?
There we go. There we go.
The switch on my cable, I didn't think I turned off. Okay, just short and sweet. How are these practices going to be chosen? I fear that people will choose practices because they're fun or easy rather than effective at helping them succeed. And I think we have to address the question and not merely let people be lazy. We want them to be successful.
I think one good thing about Essence, Tom, is that if people do choose a practice because it's fun, which is a perfectly good reason to choose things, what you can do is test that it's being successful. So even at a kind of quantitative way, reading, is this activity in this activity space helping me achieve the things that I should be? And if this practice is about helping me, for example, understand my stakeholders, is it doing that? I can look at the checklists on the alphas and see if I'm actually answering the questions that I should. So at the very least, you have an understanding of why you're doing a practice, and that makes it easier to test whether it's being effective or not. Does that answer the question? Good, thank you.
Double thumbs up from Tom. Awesome. Okay. Alexander wrote an interesting question in the chat, and Simon, you gave him a brief answer in the chat. Would you like to give him the long answer so he can actually watch it in the recording, like you said?
Yeah, so Alexander asked, have you used Essence to bring people in the wider organization up to speed with what the basic concerns are in software engineering? I'm thinking of a product management department, for example, in a non-IT company. Does Essence help to identify ways they can interact with development as well as the competencies they would need? How do I convince them they need to look at Essence and realize that the work they do in the run-up to product development needs to improve in this area or that? Essence is not trivial to understand, and its language seems tailored to more technical folk. So there's a lot in that question, obviously. I'll address the easier bits first. So in terms of Essence with wider parts of an organization, there's a couple of good examples. Mike's got one with the work he was talking about earlier, actually, which I'll let him expand on, but there's product involved in their leadership teams as well as engineering. But another slightly off-field, off-piste example is where we used Essence with one client, which is a technical company, but they've got lots of kind of product and kind of not engineering people around trying to work out how they're going to scale. So they're just about the right size to not need many scaling approaches, but they wanted to double the size of their engineers and grow their customers by 10 times. And they wanted to build an engineering manifesto that would help them do that. And the way that we helped them do that was actually using Essence and saying, well, let's use Essence to understand all the things that have to happen from, a Conivar's landscape, from the vision to the need being met, and all the things that are happening. Let's look at what the strengths of the organization are and what the weaknesses are, and more specifically, when we scale, which of those existing practices and those existing activities that happen are going to start to creak. And what that let them do was provide lots of different lenses to how they deliver value. And we use the activity spaces to do that, and we also use some other things like leadership and the ability to make decisions as different lenses with which they could draw out what are the things they really wanted to focus on as they scale to make sure that they kept everything on track. And that was involving the whole organization, data scientists and product management and product specialists as well as engineers. So you can do that, and the language is a little bit technical. The only bit that's really software centric though is we talk about the software system. In reality, most of the rest of Essence talks about things that are completely agnostic of the solution being a software solution. So a little bit of a sleight of hand, like you do with the Agile Manifesto, and let's ignore the software word. A lot of the rest of Essence has got huge utility to organizations, whatever kind of solution they're trying to achieve, whether that's a business change, policy work, hardware, it could be all kinds of things.
I would only add that the danger in the statement I've come across here is, do you say, how do you convince someone that they have to improve? That was always a hard battle. I've ran some Essence games with Scrum teams, like how well do you Scrum or inspect our retro, and the answer has not been what the team expected, and it's been a very it's been constructive, but it's also been destructive. You have to be quite careful how you use it, because within 15 minutes with one of the teams I work with, we really got to some very big dysfunctions within their team. And it took us to quite a dangerous place. So, yeah, you need to be careful as well. That would be my comment.
Let me address that point too. We are very well aware of that most people don't care so much about the underlying semantics. We don't need to, and we shouldn't need to. The analogy we have used is that to drive a car, you don't really need to know how the motor works or how the technology, which is quite advanced, how it works, but you still can drive it. And we need to be able to provide an essence that is under the hood. It's something very few people really need to care about. But it's important to get it to work for those people who are going to basically just use it, drive a car.
Great, thank you so much for the answers. I'm sure Alexander will appreciate it when he watches the recording, because he had to drop out shortly after writing the question in the chat. So I'm going to invite the speakers and Eva for any closing thoughts at this point. I think we've had about 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience, some lovely questions. Sounds like there's an appetite to get people to get their hands on Essence and learn more. And I can see that Simon helpfully shared a few links in the chat if you'd like to follow up with any of that. But any last thoughts from the speakers or Eva?
I'd just like to thank Mike, Eva, and Simon for helping me to gain a better understanding about how I might be able to use Essence.
Lovely.
Yeah, I would like to say that we have been working on this for quite many years. I gave a speech in Lisbon a couple of weeks ago, and I started by saying that it was said that Abraham Lincoln was asked the question, how long time do you need to prepare a talk? And his answer was that if I have an hour to speak, I can do it in one day. But if I have to do it in 7 minutes, I need a month. And in our case, I have prepared this talk for 15 years. So you can imagine how fast I will be. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it was not so fast. It takes a while to get under the hood of this stuff, Essence. But we have seen a dramatic interest the last year, both from other colleagues that we are very happy to have worked with, and also from the academic world. I'm actually speaking at universities, several universities in the coming months. That has happened just recently. And we have a forum with 62 university professors working together to come up with a new education in software engineering. But of course, eventually it means that the industry needs to adopt it. Companies need to say, this is the way we want to do it. And compared to a year ago when we had basically no company daring, they were very interested, but no one really said, I want to do it. Today we are really busy. And yes, we start to make a little money too. It can't hurt.
Lovely. Just in time for Christmas, so we can afford some shiny Christmas.
We are going to have a Christmas dinner in London, which we can afford this year.
Awesome. So any other closing thoughts, Simon or Mike?
I just thank you for everyone's attention and the questions. It's always interesting to get good questions. And as Ivar was saying just a second ago, you know, every day, every week, we think of different ways that Essence provides value and different ways to explain it to people. And it is one of those complicated things that there's so many different things it can do. It's quite hard to be concise and to be really clear about it, which is one of the challenges. And it's also, like Ivar was saying as well, it's a growth tool. It helps people identify where they want to improve. Far fewer people are serious about continuous improvement than say they are. And most people don't really want to spend money on a tool that tells them they're not as good as they think they are. Whereas enlightened leaders and teams that really do want to get a competitive advantage, that's exactly what they want. They want to be finding every way they can to improve. And you know, that's really where Essence can really help. And hopefully we're finding different ways to get that message across and finding little examples of value that you can get from it. And hopefully those links will help you.
Lovely. Thank you for the words.
Can I say one more thing? When I listen to Simon, I come up with something. You know, nowadays we can express ourselves a little bit more clear. Many people have seen us and Essence as competitor to what we are doing. And that has never been our objective. But of course, some clients select Essence because we solve problems they have, they didn't solve before. Instead, what we say is that our objective is to get all the methodologists out there to love Essence. We want safe people to love, safe and scaled agile to love Essence, because it helps them to keep our customers and to it's future-proof. And the same thing with DAD and flow and whatever we have here. We want to make everyone feel that they get something that makes their work better, not compete.
Absolutely. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone. This is where I'm going to do my awkward round of applause. Thank you so much, everyone. There we go. It's a lot better in person. But thank you so much to the speakers. Very insightful conversation. I learned a lot more about Essence today. I hope you did too. There's some links to follow up on. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight and sparing some time out of your day to listen to us. You can watch out for the recording in a few days if you've missed anything or want to recap. But yeah, thank you so much, speakers and audience, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.